horse race. You all's gonna be in a horse race.
Welcome to episode 23 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the great outdoors with two films that fall into the subgenre of backwoods horror, though to be fair, the second one is probably more backwoods adjacent. First up, we wade through the swamps of Louisiana with Southern Comfort from 1981 and director Walter Hill, starring Keith Carradine, Powers Booth, Fred Ward and Peter Coyote. Then we travel to 2005 and the Appalachian Mountains with The Descent from director Neil Marshall, starring Shauna MacDonald, Natalie Mendoza, Reid and Myanna Buring. Along the way, we'll be discussing the origins of the backwoods horror subgenre, exploring some of the classic and not so classic entries, debating whether Southern Comfort is indeed an allegory for the Vietnam War, and much, much more. But first, as always, I'd like to mention some of the key sources I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed and linked in the show notes. So when discussing both movies, I have referred to the books The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, Backwoods Horror and Terror in the Wilderness by Bernice M. Murphy, and the Palgrave Handbook of Contemporary Gothic, Volume 1, edited by Clive Bloom. When discussing Southern Comfort, I have referred to several interviews, commentaries and documentaries that can be found on the Vinegar Syndrome Special Edition Blu-ray release of the film. I've also referred to the AFI catalogue listing for the movie, an article entitled Rare Hunks, Walter Hill's Southern Comfort at 40 by Brogan Morris, and that's published on thequietus.com, and an article titled Human Frailty, Swallowed Whole on Walter Hill's Southern Comfort by Ian Murphy, and that can be found on the website brightlightsfilm.com. And when discussing The Descent, I have heavily referenced a making-of documentary titled The Descent Beneath the Scenes that can be found on YouTube, a 2006 interview with Neil Marshall on dreadcentral.com, an article entitled The Descent, Creepy Crawlers, found on the website asc.com, and the book The Making of the Descent by Janine Pipe and Neil Marshall. As I mentioned at the top of the show, both of this week's films fall into the category of backwoods horror, setting their narratives against isolated wilderness settings and emphasising anxiety through isolation. In movies of this nature, respectable city folk venture off the beaten track into the countryside, only to find that the land, and those who inhabit it, are far less than welcoming. But unlike its cousin, the folk horror movie, in these films you're far more likely to find yourself staring down the barrel of a shotgun, or pursued by cannibals, than you are to be sacrificed on a pagan altar. I'll leave it to you to decide which one you think is worse. Often criticised for demonising the rural poor, very often these movies feature attractive, wholesome and middle-class outsiders, falling victim to insular, psychotic and quite often physically repellent rural inhabitants, emphasising a conflict that is not only physical but also one that is socio-economic. And this is probably where our second movie this week breaks away from the pack. Writing in the Palgrave Book of Contemporary Gothic, writer Tosha Taylor makes the point that The Descent is rather unusual, in that our outsider protagonists are not actually menaced by the locals. Unless, of course, you count subterranean cave-dwelling monsters as locals. She goes on to make the point that for the first half of the movie, the threat comes not from other beings, but instead from the land itself, as our protagonists become sealed underground through a cave-in and ultimately are undone by the cavern's geography. She also highlights that by avoiding depictions of any human locals, director Neil Marshall avoids the film entering the realm of what has been termed quote-unquote hillbilly horror, despite the movie being set in what is traditionally seen, in the movies at least, as quintessential hillbilly country. The roots of the subgenre and the idea of being hunted or pursued through the wilderness can be traced all the way back to RKO's 1932 production, The Most Dangerous Game, which we talked about a few weeks ago when we discussed the history of that very studio. But while that film and its immediate descendants depicted the wealthy elite hunting the average Joe for sport, Backwoods horror reverses that dynamic, suggesting instead that it's rural America that wants to kill you. And its true origins are probably a little more recent, emerging somewhat improbably from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960. Norman Bates, his mother, and his motel may seem quite a distance from the log cabin dwellers of Wrong Turn, or indeed the Sawyer family of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But original writer Robert Bloch and director Alfred Hitchcock make use of a narrative device that would become central to the idea of the backwoods horror genre: isolation from a supposed civilized society and the resentments of those that the world has quote-unquote left behind. The Bates Motel, once a thriving roadside business, is now on its last legs, and as Norman himself tells Marion Crane, quote, "Since the new highway came through here, business has dropped off a lot," end quote. Norman and his motel have been left behind by progress, a relic of the past waiting to trap the unwary traveller. Marion Crane really should have kept on driving. But it was in 1964 that we would see the film that originates so many of the tropes that would come to populate the genre, all the way up to more recent examples, including the quite brilliant horror spoof Tucker and Dale vs. Evil from 2010, although I guess 15 years ago probably isn't that recent. And the film that I'm talking about is the Splatterfest 2000 Maniacs from the original Godfather of Gore, Herschel Gordon Lewis. His second movie after Blood Feast, and definitely a step up in all aspects of production, but still not exactly what one would call polished, Lewis described this movie as being his personal favourite, and as close to a handmade personal film as he ever made. And I have to say that out of all of his movies, this is probably the one that I enjoy the most, or at least the one that I've watched more than once. Described by more than a few people as a horror version of the musical Brigadoon, this film tells the story of a Confederate ghost town, massacred during the American Civil War, and that reappears on the centenary of the event to exact revenge. Never one to pull his punches, Lewis opens the film with a group of unsuspecting Yankees lured off the highway by a detour sign and the promise of good old-fashioned Southern hospitality. And that hospitality includes a man being rolled down a hill inside a barrel lined with metal spikes, another being drawn and quartered in a sadistic horse race, a woman being hacked to death with an axe and then barbecued, and another crushed beneath a giant boulder in a rather bizarre carnival-style dunk tank contraption. And if all of that sounds a little extreme for your taste, it's probably worth remembering that more than one critic has suggested that Herschel Gordon Lewis movies are far better watched than read or heard about. Just don't go in expecting any Oscar-grade acting or indeed cinematography. As well as the gore, what Lewis also introduces are moonshine-chugging and banjo-playing locals, the otherness of the Deep South, Confederate flags, and somebody shouting, "I reckon we got ourselves the making of a barbecue," all of which would be greatly reinforced by the many, many films that would follow. In 1970, the American poet and novelist James Dickey published his book Deliverance, a story of 4 suburban men whose weekend canoe trip into the wilds of northern Georgia goes horribly wrong and descends into sexual assault and violence. It was a critical and commercial success and spent months on the New York Times bestseller list, and even earned Dickey a National Book Award nomination. Quite naturally, Hollywood took notice, and the novel was optioned by Warner Brothers, with the film adaptation, directed by John Boorman, released in 1972. Starring Jon Voight, Burt Reynolds, Ned Beatty, and Ronnie Cox, the film was a major box office hit, and also, very importantly, a cultural reference point. People who have never seen the film can be heard humming the dueling banjo sequence to suggest otherness, even if most of them can't name the tune or its origin. And as for the cultural afterlife of the line of dialogue, "squeal like a piggy," probably the less we say about that, the better. Incidentally, the dueling banjos riff actually began life as a track called Feuding Banjos, which was published in 1954 by a man called Arthur Smith. Rearranged by Eric Weisberg and Steve Mandel and popularised by the movie, the track hit number 2 on the US charts for multiple weeks, and in 1974 won a Grammy for the Best Country Instrumental. However, rather unfortunately, it was used in the movie without any acknowledgement for its original composer Arthur Smith, and instead the film credited Weisberg and Mandel. Smith later sued for both credit and royalties and won a substantial settlement, joking that the payout bought him a yacht. Deliverance is a film that paved the way for those that followed, and has been an undeniable influence on the subgenre. As well as our first film this week, it has been cited by Neil Marshall as one of the touch points for his movie The Descent, and its DNA can be found all over films as varied as 2003's Wrong Turn and the 2008 British hoodie horror Eden Lake. Though I would argue that structurally, that film has far more in common with our first movie this week than it does John Boorman's. And then, in 1974, came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and with it the genre splintered into two distinct paths. In her book, The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, writer Bernice Murphy identifies two main strands of backwoods horror. The first includes films like Deliverance, which are characterised by antagonists who are resentful working-class men. These films often stage a clash between competing versions of masculinity, the urban versus the rural, all played out against a backdrop of an unforgiving wilderness. But more than that, these films often also highlight quote-unquote civilised societies' encroachment on the natural landscape. In Deliverance, the entire region is destined to be submerged beneath a dam that will provide power to distant cities. Meanwhile, in the film Mother's Day, which we'll mention a little bit later, one character gazes out across a lake and remarks, quote, "You know, we could really make this place into something. 6 lanes of blacktop right there to the lake, pave that whole area for a parking lot, maybe a taco stand here, some landfill, shopping centres and casinos." End quote. And with that kind of mindset, it's rather hard to blame the locals for turning against them. Films that fit into this category also include the made-for-TV movie Deliver Us from Evil from 1973, starring George Kennedy, Jan Michael Vincent and Jack Weston. This tells the story of a group of friends who are hiking through the Rocky Mountains, who kill an injured skyjacker and then fight over his stolen money, turning against each other in a series of betrayals, and of course dying one by one. The highly enjoyable Race with the Devil from 1975 also fits into this category, while flirting with occult conspiracies and throwing in a touch of Rock'em Shock'em Demolition Derby for good measure. It stars Warren Oates, Peter Fonda, Loretta Swit and Lara Parker as a group of friends whose luxury motorhome holiday goes horribly wrong when they witness a satanic ritual. Televised as part of the BBC horror double bills that inspired this podcast, I have to say it freaked the hell out of me when I first saw it at the age of about 11, and has perhaps one of the most devastating climaxes of a horror movie that I can remember. Well, for the time anyway. This was followed in 1977 by a little-known movie called Rituals, which is a Canadian horror starring Hal Holbrook, who is perhaps best known as Father Malone from John Carpenter's The Fog. This story follows a troupe of rather questionable doctors on a wilderness trip in northern Ontario, who are stalked by somebody who first cripples them, effectively, by stealing their boots, and then picks them off one by one. But, despite its origins, not all films in this strand are American, or indeed Canadian. More recent entries include ones from Britain, such as Wilderness from 2006, in which juvenile delinquents are hunted on a remote island. Then there's Eden Lake from 2008, in which juvenile delinquents torment a couple on a weekend break. There's A Lonely Place to Die from 2011, which features no juvenile delinquents at all, but instead a group of mountaineers being stalked by human traffickers, and the very good Caliber from 2018, in which two friends on a hunting weekend make a terrible mistake and find themselves trapped by a hostile and close-knit community. The second strand that Bernice Murphy suggests is populated by the degenerate and the savage, insular family groups that barely rise above the monstrous, and whose violence often includes cannibalism. This lineage begins with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and continues through films like Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, in which a family on a camping trip run afoul of a group of cannibals. This film was apparently loosely based on the myth of the cannibal Sawney Bean and his family, and we discussed it in a bit more detail back in episode 10. In 1980, Troma gave us Mother's Day that we mentioned earlier, featuring a monstrous matriarch and her sadistic offspring. And a year later, in 1981, director Jeff Lieberman released Just Before Dawn, a much overlooked and highly enjoyable slasher in the woods. This movie features some truly stunning woodland cinematography, and also quite possibly the toughest final girl in horror, who takes out one of the villains in a way that Laurie Strode could only dream of. To be fair, it may be a little too slow for some people, but I have to say, I quite like it. More recent entries include the inevitable reboots and remakes of both The Hills Have Eyes and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as well as the seemingly endless Wrong Turn franchise, now 7 films in all, and each, to my mind at least, with diminishing returns. Being blunt, between those and the now 9 Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, it seems a lot less like flogging a dead horse, and more like ripping it to shreds and throwing the bits around with abandon, but that's just my opinion. Perhaps more interestingly, in 2006, the Doctor Who universe got in on the act, with its spin-off series Torchwood, and a standalone episode called Countryside. Essentially, a version of The Hills Have Eyes set in the Welsh Valleys, it's a superbly mean-spirited episode, and as it bears no relation at all to the overarching narrative of the series, you can safely watch it in isolation without feeling too confused. All of which brings us to the first of this week's movies, which is 1981's Southern Comfort. Directed by Walter Hill, it stars Keith Carradine, Powers Booth, Fred Ward, Peter Coyote, T.K. Carter, and Lewis Smith. And we are going to be getting into the spoilers very early with this one, so if you have yet to see Southern Comfort, now is the time to press pause and track it down. However, before you do, a word of caution, and apologies, this is something that I meant to say at the end of last week's episode and completely forgot. For those of you of a sensitive disposition, particularly any vegetarians or vegans amongst you, or indeed those meat eaters who don't like to know where your food comes from, this movie does feature, towards the end, the slaughter of 2 pigs and their preparation for human consumption. And it's front and centre in the middle of the screen, and might be something that you would rather not watch. So, approach this one with a bit of caution. Walter Hill was born in Long Beach, California in 1942. His grandfather was what was known as a wildcat oil driller, which means that he drilled exploratory oil wells in areas that were not known at the time to be oil fields. And his father worked as a supervisor on the assembly line for an American aerospace and defense company called Douglas Aircraft. He remembers both men as being smart and physical, who worked with their heads and their hands, and that they both had a great mechanical ability. And I think it's fair to assume that you can probably see traits of both his father and his grandfather in several of the characters of Hill's movies. Although he had a happy childhood, he was severely asthmatic and as a result missed several years of school, a period that helped him to feel comfortable in his own company and also helped to fire his imagination. He read extensively, listened to the radio, and lived in what he called an imaginary world, one that was dominated by stories, narratives, characters, and abstract ideas. And I'm sure it's not surprising to anyone that, much like many of the directors we've discussed in this series, he became a fan of the movies at a very early age, enjoying films across a wide range of genre, with the possible exclusion of films that were designed for children. He would later recall going to the cinema at the weekends with his brother, a place that he described as a temple and somewhere that magic would happen. By the time he was 15, his asthma had started to recede, and he began to think about becoming either a writer or a comic book illustrator. He studied art at the University de las Americas in Mexico City, and then transferred and majored in history at Michigan State. During this period, he became a fan of the writer Ernest Hemingway, an influence again that we can see tonally, if not thematically, in many of his movies. When he graduated in 1964, he was, like many of his generation, called up for the US Army, but his childhood asthma made him ineligible, and this forced him to really think about what he wanted to do for a career. This might seem rather unusual these days, but as he has said in interviews, quote, "When you are that age, you think you are going to be in the army for 2 years. It's a huge amount of time, and so you don't bother worrying about what you're doing. But suddenly, this whole thing was upon me." End quote. His first job was researching historical documentaries, and this triggered an interest in film direction, a move that was particularly inspired by European cinema and movies from Japan. He realised that he wanted to tell stories in a different way than the movies being made in Hollywood at the time, something that was becoming more common among the young filmmaking community due to the collapse of the Hollywood studio system and the growth of independent and art house cinema. This interest led him to find a job at Universal Studios, although initially this was in the post room, because he understood that this would be a good way to meet people. Shortly after this, he got into the training program of the Directors Guild of America and started working in television as an apprentice on TV shows, including the Western shows Gunsmoke and Bonanza. In 1968, he got a job as the second assistant director on The Thomas Crown Affair, starring Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway, and in the same year also worked, although uncredited, as the second assistant director on the movie Bullitt, again starring Steve McQueen. Throughout this time, he was writing screenplays in the evenings and at weekends, and although he says it took him 4 or 5 years to write his first screenplay, once he began to find his voice, screenwriting turned into a viable living. His first completed screenplay was a Western, and though it was never put into production, it was greatly admired by executives at Warner Brothers, who asked him to start pitching some projects. He was hired to rewrite the script for the movie The Thief Who Came to Dinner, which eventually starred Ryan O'Neal and Jacqueline Bisset, and was also hired to co-write the movie The Getaway, another movie that would star Steve McQueen and that would be directed by Sam Peckinpah. At the same time, as those of you who have listened to episode 14 will remember, he also appeared in a very minor role in the 1973 indie horror movie Messiah of Evil, meeting a sticky end at the hands of a rather nasty and razor blade wielding little girl. The screenwriting continued, including an uncredited rewrite of Dan O'Bannon's screenplay for Alien, but of course what he really wanted to do was direct, something that came to fruition with the 1975 release of his directorial debut, Hard Times. This was a Depression-era set movie about bare-knuckle boxing and starred Charles Bronson and James Coburn. He followed this in 1978 with The Driver, starring Ryan O'Neal and Isabella Gianni, which was widely panned by the critics and also a commercial failure. Isabella Gianni even went so far as to say that it ruined her American film career. That being said, it's gone on to become something of a cult classic and highly influential, referenced by Quentin Tarantino in Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill, as well as Drive from Nicholas Winding Refn and Edgar Wright's Baby Driver. Fortunately for Hill, by the time the film was released to a less than enthusiastic reception, he was already shooting his next movie, and he has said that had this not been the case, his career probably wouldn't have survived. Although The Driver was very popular in Europe, it made little to no money in the US, and at the time, the US market was really the only thing that mattered. This experience probably goes a long way to explain his comments about 1970s cinema in an interview on the Southern Comfort Blu-ray release, saying that although the 70s is now regarded as a golden era of independent filmmaking, in hindsight, those who lived through it barely noticed the so-called Renaissance. Fortunately for Hill, his next movie was a very different story, and this was The Warriors that was released in 1979, a film that has more than a little in common with the basic setup of Southern Comfort. This follows a street gang who have to escape from the Bronx of the 1970s after being framed for the murder of a rival gang leader. On its first release, it received rather negative reviews from critics for its lack of realism and also for some of its dialogue, but it grossed $22.5 million worldwide against a $4 million budget. Sadly though, initial screenings were marked by violence and were linked in the press to both vandalism and murder. The controversy prompted Paramount Studios to stop advertising the movie and also to release theatres from their contractual obligations to screen the film. As we can tell from the box office figures though, this did absolutely nothing to dampen the enthusiasm of the audience, and the film has since been retrospectively reappraised. The New York Times placed it on its Best 1000 Movies Ever Made list in 2003, and Entertainment Weekly has named it among the top 50 greatest cult movies ever made. The actor Powers Booth, who plays the character of Hardin in Southern Comfort, has said that every film that Walter Hill ever made was a Western. It's just that he didn't tell anybody that's what he was doing. And so it comes as no surprise that his follow-up to The Warriors was indeed a Western movie. And this was The Long Riders, which was released in 1980. Based on the life of Jesse James and his gang, very unusually, Hill cast 4 sets of brothers to play the real-life brothers that made up the gang. David, Keith and Robert Carradine, James and Stacey Keach, Dennis and Randy Quaid, and Christopher and Nicholas Guest. Unfortunately, the film was a disappointment, both critically and financially, but it did mark the first time that he would work with Keith Carradine, who would go on to play Spencer in Southern Comfort, and also the musician Ry Cooder, who would provide the film's memorable score. Following this, he started working on Southern Comfort, which was itself inspired by sequences featuring Cajun characters from his debut movie, Hard Times. And here we now come on to a point of contention, or at least a point of contention for Walter Hill. It's widely believed that Southern Comfort is an allegory for the Vietnam War, with the largely unseen Cajuns standing in for the Vietnamese. And if you've seen the film, it's quite easy to understand why this is the case. Certainly, Keith Carradine thought so when reading the screenplay for the first time, going on to say that he thought it was about the futility of the whole exercise. Others have taken it a step further and attacked the film for this supposed metaphor. In the otherwise excellent book, Men, Women and Chainsaws, the writer Carol J. Clover accuses the film of, quote, blaming the entire Vietnam experience from initial involvement to failure on the redneck, end quote, focusing very much on the controversy inherent in Backwoods horror that I mentioned earlier, the demonization of the rural poor. And I have to say, I'm not entirely sure I agree with this perspective. Southern Comfort makes it completely clear that the horrors endured by the National Guardsmen are very much of their own making, and apart from 2 of the characters, the blame is pretty much evenly shared amongst them. From the very beginning of the movie, we have a group of National Guardsmen entering a space to which they do not belong, motivated by the promise of sex workers at the end of the mission. Beginning with trespass and the theft of boats, and then escalating to vigilanteism, more trespass, criminal damage, kidnapping, assault, and eventually murder. If this is indeed an analogy for Vietnam, then the American military certainly don't come across very well. The boats that they commandeer, or basically steal, represent not only a mode of transport, but also their original owners' livelihoods. And when those owners quite understandably follow them to the edge of the bayou, they are shot at by the juvenile Stucky, played quite brilliantly by Lewis Smith. And given that they would not know that Stucky is basically firing blanks, one can hardly blame them for retaliating. As one of the Cajuns states at the end of the movie, quote, "We live back in here. This is our home, and ain't nobody fuck with us." End quote. Here we have a supposed civilized invading force that fails to cope under pressure, panics at the first sign of trouble, falls into infighting and insanity, and whoop and holler at a quote-unquote successful raid, when in actuality, all they have done is attack a disabled man and accidentally blown up his shack. And most importantly, it very quickly becomes apparent that they think all of the Cajuns are pretty much one and the same, highlighting their bigotry and xenophobia, even after Spencer stresses that they have no proof their victim was one of the men who shot at them. He just happens to be the first Cajun that they've come across since. So it's no wonder then that, Hardin and Reese aside, they all turn out to be pretty easy pickings for the supposedly disadvantaged enemy. Perhaps understandably, actors Powers Booth and Keith Carradine, who play Hardin and Reese, are perhaps a little bit more sympathetic to the characters, with Carradine describing the troops as neither heroes or villains, but instead hapless individuals and weekend warriors that were thrust into a hostile environment and forced to survive through their wits and sheer luck. And this is a sentiment with which Powers Booth agrees, highlighting that the troops are so far over their heads that all they can do is play the cards they have been dealt. Hardin and Spencer soon form a partnership in the movie and are the film's true realists, offering a telling exchange about the random nature of cause and effect, giving an insight into how one error of judgment can bring the whole world crashing down. Quote, "All this because some asshole fires blanks from a machine gun, or because some asshole stole some boats." End quote. Both men offer practical solutions for the situation, which generally fall on deaf ears and are overridden by Casper, a man desperately clinging onto rank, file and process, despite the increasing severity of the situation. And despite now being the officer in charge, Casper is later exposed as a failure by the basic ineffectiveness of his homemade hand grenade, which does nothing to the enemy save create a small cloud of temporary smoke. Reese's summation of how long it will take the National Guard to realise they are missing is pragmatic in the extreme, and it is Hardin who realises toward the end of the movie that the two are not as safe in the Cajun village as they initially supposed. And it is this final sequence of supposed safety overturned, as well as the overall mise-en-scène, that to my mind anticipates 2008's Eden Lake far more greatly than Deliverance, a film to which it is far more often compared. But despite viewer and Carradine's assertions that Southern Comfort is a Vietnam allegory, Hill is adamant that this was not the case, and more than one journalist has reported him as bristling when the term is raised. Not that the comparison was unexpected. At the first table read with the cast, he announced that he knew inferences would be made, but that this was not the intention, and that he didn't want to hear any more about it. For him, it is a story about the National Guard and some Cajuns in the Louisiana bayou, nothing more and nothing less. In later interviews, he has conceded, though, that Vietnam was certainly an influence, but in the same interview also went on to say that you should never believe interviews with directors, as they are all quote-unquote bullshit artists anyway. Although one of the criticisms made of the film on its release was that many of the characters aren't fully rounded, they are, in fact, archetypes of the male persona, representing the outsider, the reluctant hero, the aggressor, the joker, the innocent, and the fragile authority figure, to name just a few. And despite their differences, there is, for some of them at least, a bond of friendship, something that is highlighted by Casper when Spencer suggests that they leave the bodies of their fallen comrades behind. "In case you'd forgotten, Spencer," he says, "these were friends of ours." The cast list reads like a who's who of late 70s and early 80s cinema. Alongside Powers Booth and Keith Carradine, we also have Fred Ward as the increasingly volatile Reese, and he is of course possibly best recognised by horror fans now for the 1990 sci-fi movie Tremors. Peter Coyote, soon to appear in E.T. and Roman Polanski's Bitter Moon, appears as the soon-to-be-dispatched Captain Poole, and Brian James turns up as the unfortunate Cajun trapper. And if he looks somewhat familiar, that will be because you've seen him in Blade Runner, 48 Hours, or The Horror Show, which you might know under its alternative title, House 3. The performances in the film are universally accomplished, making it difficult to single out any one actor from what is essentially a very tight ensemble cast. Booth and Carradine are excellent, as is Fred Ward, but perhaps special mention should go to Lewis Smith, who plays Stucky, the character whose actions set much of the film's chaos in motion. Making his film debut, Smith begins as an unbearably irritating character before gradually regressing into a childlike state of fearful submission. And of course, he also delivers one of the film's most horrifying moments, providing a death scene that probably reawakened long-buried trauma in any Generation X viewers as he sinks helplessly into a body of quicksand. If nothing else, Hill certainly has an eye for talent, as very few of the cast were that well known at the time. Peter Coyote recalls being so desperate for work that he would have taken any script going. Even so, in interviews, he has recalled that he was less than impressed with Hill's aestheticization of violence and the multiple slow-motion shooting sequences. To him, this was both a political and artistic mistake, especially in a film that would be so clearly read as an allegory for Vietnam. In his eyes, making the death scenes in this movie beautiful was simply wrong, and he often argued with the director on this very point. And let's be honest, the film is, quite frankly, quite beautiful. Much of that is thanks to director of photography Andrew Laszlo, whom Hill credits much of what's good about the movie. Laszlo had previously worked with Hill on The Warriors, and it was he who suggested the use of desaturated colours. He also introduced Hill to Korean War photography, suggesting that they try, wherever possible, to recreate the stark, washed-out look. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in the moment when the patrol crosses the bayou in their stolen canoes. The Cajuns first appear at the edge of the water, a very small group of figures in the lower right-hand corner of the frame, surrounded by the brown of the lake and the pale green moss hanging from the trees. It's an incredibly painterly composition, as is the fleeting shot of sunrise through the swamp, glimpsed again through layers of green and brown. The colour palette throughout is pale and muted, all the better of course to make the vivid red of blood stand out all the more as the violence escalates. The cinematography is matched beautifully by an evocative score from Ry Cooder, an American guitarist, composer and producer with a very distinctive slide guitar sound and a deep knowledge of American roots music. Cooder first gained recognition as a session musician and worked with artists including the Rolling Stones, Captain Beefheart and Randy Newman, before releasing solo albums in the 1970s and beyond. He's widely celebrated for his ability to evoke place and atmosphere and played a central role in the creative process. He travelled to the Louisiana locations with the cast and crew to record ambient sounds and draw inspiration directly from the environment, and he also helped to source the local musicians that feature in the film's Cajun village sequence. The resulting score is lean, spare, and hauntingly atmospheric, painting musical landscapes that stand as equal to the visual compositions that Andrew Laszlo captures with his camera. Cooder first worked with Hill on The Long Riders, and his other scores include Hill's follow-up movies Streets of Fire in 1984 and Crossroads in 1986. But perhaps most famously, he also contributed the score to Wim Wenders' 1984 movie Paris, Texas, which remains one of the most iconic soundtracks of the 1980s, if not cinema altogether. Filming on location in a swamp was, as you can imagine, not a particularly easy process, Filming had to take place in the winter to avoid the risk of moccasin snakes and alligators, and the cast and crew had to travel for an hour and a half each day to reach the location. Wearing wetsuits beneath their uniforms to prevent hypothermia, they then spent their days submerged in water, but as all remember it, nobody complained, creating a sense of camaraderie between the cast and also the crew, who were also submerged while trying to maneuver cameras and sound equipment. And due to the shifting nature of the swamp and the instability of the ground beneath their feet, getting the shots and the sound right first time became all the more important, and there certainly was no opportunity for Stanley Kubrick-style multiple takes in this landscape. The film was edited by Freeman David, another man that Hill acknowledges made the movie what it is today, including the slow-motion death scenes that so annoyed Peter Coyote. Hill has said that this film was very much made in the editing room, particularly the final moments, which felt on paper anticlimactic given all that has gone before. It was David who suggested that the final shot of the trucks appear in slow motion, with cuts back to Carradine and Booth's faces, highlighting the tension as they, and the audience, wait to see exactly who is behind the wheel. Nevertheless, despite all of that, I do still find the ending somewhat unsatisfying, its ambiguity feeling a little bit like a cop-out more than anything else. On its release in 1981, the film was not commercially successful, at least in the States, partly down to a poor marketing strategy, though it was very well received by the critics. It really found its audience on TV, cable and home video, and was a staple of the corner video store in the 1980s. Since then, it has been widely praised, both as an allegory of Vietnam, sorry Walter, as well as a study of male propensity to violence. More recently, it has been released as a special edition by boutique specialist Vinegar Syndrome and also Second Sight, and is now widely recognised, along with The Warriors, as being Hill's greatest film. Following the release of Southern Comfort, Walter Hill continued to direct several acclaimed and commercially successful movies, including 48 Hours in 1982, which helped launch Eddie Murphy's career. He also directed Streets of Fire in 1984, which I haven't seen, but am reliably informed that it's totally bonkers. He moved into television and edged a little further into horror by directing the pilot episode Cutting Cards for the cult 1980s anthology series Tales from the Crypt, on which he also served as an executive producer. He was also executive producer on HBO's Deadwood from 2004 to 2006, and the Western miniseries Broken Trail, also in 2006, both of which earned him critical acclaim and multiple Emmy nominations and awards. More recently, he has served as producer for the Alien franchise, and in that capacity we will soon see his name on screen again with the release of Alien Romulus 2, which is currently in pre-production. Southern Comfort is, of course, not really a horror movie at all, and you're probably thinking I'm pushing my luck a bit by including it in this week's double bill. But as I said right at the beginning of the series, when I badly paraphrased John Carpenter, for me horror isn't a genre, it's a feeling. And with its grim commentary, dog attacks, booby traps, and rather unfortunate pig slaughtering, Southern Comfort certainly elicits quite a bit of that. And so from my perspective, it absolutely earns its place here. Not least because it also anticipates so many actual horror films that would follow, including, as I've mentioned, Eden Lake, and of course the second of this week's double bill, The Descent. All of which brings us quite nicely onto that very movie. Released in 2005, it stars Shauna MacDonald, Natalie Mendoza, Reid and Myanna Buring, and was directed by Neil Marshall. Now we're getting into the spoilers very early again with this one, so as always, if you've yet to see the movie, please proceed with all due caution. I first saw The Descent when it was initially released in cinemas, and I persuaded a friend to come along with me, with the reassuring words that I was certain it wouldn't be all that scary. About 30 minutes in, I found myself quietly whispering a series of apologies, and that was before we'd even encountered the crawlers. I saw it again quite recently on the big screen for its 4K restoration, and I have to say, it's more than stood the test of time. Coincidentally enough, even on the day of recording, I happened to stumble across a video of some YouTubers reacting to it, and their responses were pretty much identical to my friends all those years ago. It's a movie that plays on multiple fears: the loss of a child, claustrophobia, betrayal of a friend, the dark, and of course the nightmare prospect of subterranean cave-dwelling humanoids, all within its remarkably lean and mean 99-minute runtime. Director Neil Marshall says that he set out to make a truly scary movie, a film that just where you think it can't get any worse, it does. And I have to say, in my opinion, he more than succeeded. Neil Marshall was born in 1970 in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, and he was inspired to become a filmmaker after a trip to the cinema at the age of 11 in 1981. He's actually the same age as me, though he's achieved far, far more. And I have to say, back in the late 70s and early 80s, there really was something quite magical about going to the movies. It was a true golden era if you were a kid, from Star Wars to The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, to the film that Marshall himself considers to be the greatest movie ever made, Raiders of the Lost Ark. He has described the film as being flawlessly executed by a director at the very top of his game, and for him, Indiana Jones is one of cinema's most enduring and iconic characters. From the moment he saw the movie, the direction of his life was set. Following this, he began shooting his own short films on Super 8, fully immersing himself in the process by writing, directing, filming, and editing. After finishing school, he went on to study film at Newcastle Polytechnic, which is now Northumbria University, where he gained a more formal ground in editing, cinematography, and production. His graduation project was a comedy zombie movie, and it brought him into contact with a group of independent filmmakers also based in the northeast of England. In 1995, he was asked to co-write and edit, albeit unpaid, for director Bharat Naloori's first movie, Killing Time, a low-budget crime film that was clearly a learning experience in more ways than one. According to a later interview, everything that could go wrong on a film went wrong on that one, and although nobody was killed, fortunately, some people were injured and also assaulted. A riot broke out at one of their locations, their runners were mugged, and the armourer for the movie had his car broken into. But nevertheless, despite all of this, they managed to complete the project. He continued working as an editor for the next 6 years, and in 2001 secured financing for his debut feature Dog Soldiers, a horror comedy about a squad of soldiers on overnight manoeuvres who were attacked by a pack of werewolves. Starring Sean Pertwee, Kevin McKidd and Liam Cunningham, the film also reflects Marshall's love of genre cinema, with Easter eggs for films including The Matrix, Alien, Evil Dead and Zulu. It was very well received by British audiences and critics, though it was one of those reviews, albeit a favourable one, that led to the creation of this week's movie. The reviewer asked whether a British filmmaker was ever going to make a truly scary movie again, and Marshall has described that moment as feeling like somebody throwing down the gauntlet. The idea for the film was inspired by an old school trip to some lead mines, where Marshall experienced true, complete darkness for the very first time. He came up with the concept on a train journey following a meeting with potential backers, with the idea of filming a horror movie set in a pitch-black cave making perfect sense. In fact, the film was originally going to be called The Dark, a title that was very much inspired by the 1980 James Herbert novel. However, there was already a movie in production with that name, and so the title was initially changed to Crawl Space. That competing film, by the way, was also released in 2005 and starred Sean Bean and Maria Bello. It's a very strange, almost folk horror movie set in Wales that deals with religious cults and Welsh mythology. It's not a completely perfect film by any means, but it has a certain atmosphere and edge to it, along with an incredibly bleak tone, and I would say it's definitely worth checking out if you ever get the chance. The title Crawl Space was of course eventually abandoned, which is probably just as well, as it's also the name of a not very good Klaus Kinski horror movie from the mid-1980s, and the far more evocative title of The Descent was decided upon. Marshall has also highlighted the deliberate ambiguity of the title. It is, of course, a descent into the earth, but also, for many of the characters, a descent into madness. And in my opinion, it also further suggests the deterioration of friendship and civilized behaviour, and a retreat into primal savagery, something that is clearly exhibited by the characters of both Juno and Sarah. The director has said that the film was inspired by Alien in terms of atmosphere and dark spaces, The Shining for its descent into madness, and Deliverance for the idea of an adventure trip gone wrong. In fact, Juno's outfit is directly inspired by the wetsuit worn by Burt Reynolds in the American movie. But in many ways, The Descent is the inverse of Deliverance and Southern Comfort. Those films depict middle-aged men lost in the wilderness above ground and largely in daylight, while The Descent takes its 20-something female protagonists deep underground and traps them in pitch-black darkness. But much like those two films, the movie also depicts trespass, with our protagonists essentially venturing into the home space of the crawlers, who could be interpreted, if we are being rather generous, as just protecting their territory from an invading force. For the first half of the movie, though, the threat doesn't come from the crawlers. It comes from the land itself, and also from within the group. Just as the horrors that befall the National Guardsmen in Southern Comfort stem from Stuckey's actions, the terrors faced by the protagonists in The Descent can in many ways be pinned on the character of Juno, played quite brilliantly by Natalie Mendoza. The key difference, though, is that Stuckey's actions stem from sheer stupidity, whereas Juno's are driven by guilt and arrogance, raising another theme that is central to the movie, and that is the notion of betrayal. Quite recently, I came across either an article or a social media post, I can't really remember which, asking whether Juno was actually a villain and whether she deserved the fate that befalls her towards the end of the film. And to my mind, being completely frank, the answer to both questions is very much yes and yes. As we discover, Juno had been having an affair with her best friend's husband. She then takes the group, without their knowledge, into an unexplored cave system. When she says she wants to name it after Sarah, Sarah quite insightfully replies, "Don't you mean after yourself?" Worse still, Juno accidentally attacks Beth, and then leaves her to die at the hands of the crawlers. It's only through Sarah's horrific act of mercy that Beth is spared an even grislier fate. And to cap it all off, Juno then lies about it. To my mind, she is an utterly indefensible narcissist, but that's just my opinion. She is very good at kicking crawler ass, though. If the men of Southern Comfort are very much archetypes, the same can be said for the women of The Descent, albeit they are far more rounded. As well as Juno in the role of the fallen leader, we have Beth as the moral compass, Rebecca as the protector, Sam as the innocent, Holly as the rebel, and Sarah as both the final girl and the vengeful mother. The casting process followed the traditional route of auditions and screen tests, with only Nora Jane Noon, who plays Holly, previously known to the director, having caught his attention in the movie The Magdalene Sisters. All of the actors were impressed by the depth of the characters in the script and the opportunity to develop their own backstories. Natalie Mendoza, in particular, has commented on the rarity of being cast in a role that was not stereotypically Asian. In fact, the role of Juno had no ethnicity at all on the page, and she was cast on the strength of an audition that, according to Marshall, blew everyone's socks off. Regardless of ethnic origins, however, the physical distinctions between her and Shauna MacDonald, who plays Sarah, one dark, one fair, one athletic, one more willowy, serve to underline the opposition between the two characters. It's an opposition that is visible from the very beginning, and one that gradually evolves into outright antagonism as the film progresses, culminating in their final confrontation deep within the caves. Shauna MacDonald gives an incredibly committed performance, and has described her character's journey as less of an arc and more of a spiral, travelling from grief-stricken mother to panic-stricken and seemingly fragile team member, and finally out the other side to a vengeful and aggressive warrior. The character's rebirth is quite masterfully signalled as she emerges from a pool of blood, an image that Marshall has said is a homage to Brian De Palma's 1976 movie Carrie. They are joined by Myanna Buring, who is here making her feature debut, and many listeners will recognise her from her very successful TV and film career. She's played characters including the hard-as-nails Shell in Ben Wheatley's 2011 folk horror Kill List. She's also appeared in the Netflix series The Witcher, played the character of Long Susan in the BBC series Ripper Street, and even makes an appearance in the Twilight Saga. Alex Reid, who plays Beth, was already a huge fan of Marshall's through Dog Soldiers, which she thought was quote-unquote bonkers and brilliant, and she's also a fan of the horror genre in general. In fact, shortly after this, she would go on to appear in Wilderness, the British survival horror I mentioned a little bit earlier. Nora Jane Noon, who plays Holly, has also appeared in subsequent genre pictures, including 2008's Beyond the Rave, Neil Marshall's Doomsday in the same year, and the Backwoods cannibal movie Darlin from 2019. Finally, there is Saskia Mulder, who plays the protective and maternal Rebecca, and who had already appeared in the Danny Boyle movie The Beach from 2000. She also starred in the British comedy series The Book Group, and following The Descent, went on to become an incredibly successful actor's agent. All of the cast have recognised how rare it was to see an action film built entirely around an all-female ensemble. And even more importantly, from my point of view, rarer still was the fact that none of these women are remotely sexualised. People often point to Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley as the archetype of the strong female protagonist, and of course they have a point. But it's worth remembering that in 1979's Alien, the character was still required to strip down to a bra and vest before confronting the creature in the film's climax. Fortunately, a great deal changed between 1979 and 2005. The actors have all described Marshall as being incredibly open and supportive, not just in terms of adapting the dialogue, but also in encouraging experimentation with the characters and the script. They spoke of ad-libbing and exploring every possible way to play a scene before and during filming. It was, by all accounts, a highly collaborative process, one made possible by Marshall's refusal to accept one-dimensional characterization. Each actor worked hard to develop a detailed backstory, and while the narrative on the page remained pretty much unchanged, Marshall has said that through their contributions, the characters became far more layered and complex. For me, the film is all the richer because of it, and I think it's one of the reasons it stood the test of time. These are not your typical one-dimensional Scream Queen heroines. Not that there's anything wrong with those in the right place and at the right time. The friendship dynamic of the group is, of course, vital for the movie, and it was important for that narrative that the actors shared a chemistry and a bond of friendship, as this would make both the betrayals and their unfortunate endings all the more impactful. To facilitate this, and to give reality to the physical aspects of the movie, the cast all went caving for real in the English countryside, something that was particularly challenging for Shauna MacDonald, who is genuinely claustrophobic. She had to overcome real fears to participate, and it's little wonder then that her panicked moments in the movie seem so realistic, with so much to draw from. As well as caving, the cast also went whitewater rafting and learned to climb and abseil, experiences that MacDonald said helped to strengthen the bond between them. After all, there's nothing like holding your colleague's safety quite literally in your hands to build trust quickly and forge real relationships. For a film that is set largely underground and in near total darkness, The Descent makes striking and often surprising use of colour. These include the bright red of the flares to the flickering orange of the firelights and the quite sickly green of the infamous camcorder sequence. In lesser hands, the film might have easily become monochrome and monotonous, but instead Marshall and cinematographer Sam McCurdy use flashes of colour to both disorientate and guide the viewer, illuminating just enough to make the darkness beyond feel all the blacker, and to raise questions in the audience's mind about what exactly that darkness is concealing. And repeat viewings, especially on the big screen, certainly reveal that before we ever see the crawlers in full, there are fleeting hints of them in the background, a half-glimpsed shape waiting to be noticed. The production design, courtesy of Simon Bowles, is equally striking. Bowles had previously worked on Dog Soldiers, and what he achieves here is genuinely impressive, particularly given the film's modest budget. The cave sets were moulded from real cliff and cave formations, and accessorised with wax stalactites, continually reworked and reinvented through changes in texture, colour, and the addition of moss, creating the impression of genuine subterranean depth, an illusion that still holds up all these years later. The claustrophobia that his work creates is palpable, and has genuinely disturbed many viewers, even before the true horror is revealed. Though it must be said that more than a few people, including the YouTube reactors that I mentioned earlier, have commented on the somewhat Freudian nature of the labyrinthian cave system, though whether or not you fully buy into that analysis, I'll leave entirely up to you. Some of the sets were also extended with matte paintings, which to my mind was a very wise decision. As I've said more than once, they tend to age far more gracefully than CGI, and it's that choice, I think, that also helps the movie remain so visually convincing even now, coupled with the use of good old-fashioned practical in-camera special effects. These were created by a team led by designer Paul Hyatt, and he also provided special effects and makeup for Eden Lake in 2008, The Children in 2011, The Woman in Black in 2012, and the TV series Da Vinci's Demons from 2013 to 2014. He has since gone on to become an accomplished film director, with his 2012 debut The Seasoning House, filmed as it happens in my hometown of Brighton, followed by the werewolf feature Howl in 2015, and Heretics, which is also known as The Convent, that was released in 2018. The effects work in The Descent is incredibly impressive, and include the quite eye-watering broken leg suffered by Holly in a moment that I still find incredibly difficult to watch. As well as that, we also have the multiple wounds and lacerations inflicted by the crawlers, the dead elk that the group encounter on their way to the cave, which, had any of them been remotely superstitious, would surely have served as a warning. Hyatt's team also provided the hundreds of bones that littered the cave floors, and of course the makeup and practical effects for the crawlers themselves. The crawlers, who Marshall describes as cavemen who never left the cave, are an incredibly disturbing combination of human and monster, with bat-like ears, all the better to hear you with, my dear, and faces that deliberately echo, even if only slightly, Max Schreck's Count Orlok from the 1922 movie Nosferatu. While some directors might have chosen to cast stunt performers, dancers or acrobats in these roles, Marshall instead chose to use actors, each of whom developed their own character and physicality. These are not homogeneous monsters, but individual beings, each with their own way of moving, reacting, and attacking. The makeup process initially took around 5 hours each day, though this was gradually reduced to a slightly more manageable 3. Even so, the actors certainly suffered for their art, shaving their entire bodies, spending long days wearing little more than loincloths and prosthetic makeup, and frequently lacerating their skin while fighting and rolling across the sand that covered the set floor. By now, most people will know that the ending of the North American print was changed from the original version, and this, I think, is more than a little unfortunate. In the American cut, Sarah escapes from the cave, runs to her car, drives down the road, and is then haunted by a vision of the now dead Juno. And that's where it ends. However, the original British version reveals that this apparent escape is in fact a fugue state. We cut back to the cave, where Sarah wakes from unconsciousness to find herself still trapped, surrounded by crawlers. The final images, including a vision of her long-dead daughter and the birthday cake we saw earlier in a dream sequence, suggest that she is about to be reunited with her lost child. It's an ending that is both tragic and strangely bittersweet. The reason for this change was that test audiences in the US apparently found the original British ending far too depressing, and as a result, the US distributors wanted something that offered a glimmer of hope. The last few minutes of the original were cut, and what is left is, in my opinion, a betrayal of all that has gone before. Rather ironic, given that betrayal is one of the themes of the movie. Even worse, this ending paved the way for the perhaps inevitable sequel, The Descent Part 2, from 2009. This features much of the original cast, though mainly in flashback, as well as a handful of new characters, and opens with the frankly ludicrous premise that a team of investigators would take a heavily traumatized and conveniently amnesiac woman back to the scene of her ordeal to help the investigation. I watched about 20 minutes of it before switching off, deciding I'd rather not have it soil my memory of the original. From my point of view, the ending of the British version is the correct and only ending, so in my world, Sarah is either dead in the cave or still desperately trying to find her way out. Either way, the sequel just doesn't exist in my universe. On its release in 2005, The Descent was met with positive reviews in the UK. Mark Kermode, writing in The Observer, said that he jumped, gasped, winced, cringed, and for lengthy periods simply held his breath. The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw called it a scary and leery British horror film and commended Neil Marshall's punky flair and his ability to keep the yuck factor cranked up high. Empire magazine described it as a ferocious and claustrophobic nightmare and singled out its superb all-female cast and its uncompromising intensity. The review also stated that the movie was proof indeed that British horror was alive and well. Tragically, though, the release coincided with the 7/7 bombings in central London, a real-life atrocity that inevitably overshadowed the movie's debut. Equally tragic was the now infamous image of the destroyed number 30 bus in Tavistock Square, still bearing a poster for the movie with its tagline clearly visible: "Terror beyond belief." It became an unintentional and macabre echo of real-life horror, an image that nobody would ever have foreseen in their worst nightmares, and one that, understandably, cast a rather long shadow over the film's release. Despite this, the film went on to gross $2.6 million in the UK, and according to Johnny Walker in the book Contemporary British Horror Cinema, it was also notably the first British horror film to attract as many women to theatres as it did men. The real surprise, however, came with its American release the following year, truncated ending and all, where it earned an impressive $26 million. This success was no doubt helped by its ersatz American setting, despite having been shot entirely in the UK. And as well as cinema audiences, the US critics were equally enthusiastic. Roger Ebert called it a savage and gripping piece of work that jangles the nerves, and that would leave viewers both energised and exhilarated. The New York Times said that it was a smart and efficient exercise in pure primal terror, while Variety described it as an expertly crafted nerve jangler that delivers genuine scares without compromise. As I've mentioned throughout the discussion, the film is now 20 years old, and it still holds up remarkably well. As of the time of recording, it has just been re-released in selected cinemas, and if you have the opportunity, whether you've seen it before or not, I highly recommend going to see it on the big screen. Not only is the 4K restoration quite stunning to look at, but seeing it in a theatre really is something to behold. So definitely try to see it that way if you get the opportunity. Southern Comfort and The Descent are, as I've mentioned several times, both examples of backwoods horror, but they are also mirror images of each other. One takes place above ground in the swamps of Louisiana, where male archetypes are hunted by locals defending their home. The other plunges us deep underground into a labyrinthian cave system where our female protagonists find themselves prey to something far older and far less human. Both films examine the fragility of camaraderie and friendship and offer different perspectives on the concept of loyalty and betrayal. In Hill's vision, there is at least a glimpse of sunlight and survival, but in Marshall's, there is absolutely none. The first movie ends with a fragile truce, and the second with eternal darkness. But either way, no one makes it out entirely unchanged. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It only takes a moment, and it helps a lot more than you think. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or indeed any of the films we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram at thehorrordouble for photos, behind-the-scenes news, trailers, and other bits and pieces. Next week, we are returning to the theme of childhood, though this time it's the kids who are in danger, with two films that juxtapose fairy tale imagery with the grim realities of murder, corruption, and crime. First up, we have Night of the Hunter from 1955, the only film ever directed by the great actor Charles Laughton, and starring Robert Mitchum, Shelley Winters, and Lillian Gish. Then we'll be heading back to Mexico for the second time for the quite brilliant Tigers Are Not Afraid from 2017, written and directed by Issa Lopez, and starring Paulo Lara, Juan Ramon Lopez, Hansel Casillas, and Rodrigo Cortez. So if you want to watch along, and you're in the UK, as of the time of recording, Night of the Hunter is available to stream via the MGM Plus channel on Amazon Prime, and it's also available to rent or buy on Apple TV and Amazon Video. While Tigers Are Not Afraid is available to stream on Shudder, and is also available to watch free, but with adverts, on the UK channel My5. And you can also rent or buy it from Amazon Prime. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.